We've already heard our reading for this morning, Matthew 1, verses 18 to 25. So we get to hold that as we head into where we're headed this morning. I just want to say that it was so good to be back with you. Well, it's good to be here again today, and so good to be here last Sunday after being gone. I finished my sermon last week, and I walked into my office, and I just wept because there's just so much emotion wrapped up in it, it's so good to be with you. It's but I can't talk to you right now, so I'll see you later. So it's just the tension, all of that, and feeling gratitude for the progress that I made, but also man, there's still more healing to go, and so just feeling all of that, but all to say, it was just so good. And it is good now too. So thanks for being here again. And then I had a pretty rough week just with a lot of symptoms, but I do continue to get better and better as I continue healing from post-concussion syndrome. So thank you for the ongoing prayers and understanding and love and all of that. So last Sunday, we kicked off our Advent journey together, yes, and today that journey continues as we intentionally make room to hear the story of someone here at Salt House. So today we get to hear from Annemarie Russell. One of my favorite things that happens here in our community is how there are people here who have connections outside of Salt House, right? And sometimes those connections are from years and years ago, right? And Annemarie is one of those people for me. I've known her since the summer of 1992. Do you remember that time? And although I technically spent more time with her brother Nathan and her sister Amy, we still had the privilege of being at Holden Village together during the summer over a number of summers in a row as our families would be there at the same time. And she was a few years older than me then, and she still is now. But which meant she was when you're a teenager, even 2 or 3 years, they're so much cooler than you, right? So she was so much cooler, which means that I have a few photos of her. This one, she's on the right. That's Annemarie. That's my brother over on the left. Do you see Desta's there? So good. I don't remember the other people's names. Yeah. Oh, yeah? Oh, I didn't know that. That's awesome. I've always been man, they could sing. That was such an amazing week. Anyway, 1992, good times. So there's Annemarie in 1992 at Holden Village. Not only does she know how to rock the scrunchie, in all seriousness, Annemarie knows she tries to live life very authentically. We talked about this road of our lives that we're expected to be on last week, and she walks that road with great authenticity that I'm so grateful for, especially when it comes to the detours that we find along the way, which is why we get to hear part of her story now. So at Salt House, we do make room to tell our stories. It's one of the 7 core practices that have really organically emerged here in our community because it's the practice and the value that we hold that stories matter, right? Which means we try to be present here in this place, owning our own lives and the stories that we're living because our stories matter. We try to be curious about the stories of those folks sitting next to us each week that we bump up against here on Sundays and beyond, because the stories of others matter. So our posture then, as we head into this time, we listen to what we're about to experience, holding Annemarie's story so that we can hear our own stories in her story, so that we can hear God's story in her story, and so that we can be nudged in some way further on and further into the Jesus story too. So we call these Sundays that we do this, we call this a Salt House Stories. This is Annemarie's Salt House Story. So we get to decide then as we hear this how we move toward her story and toward each other in some way. So my friends, give a warm Salt House welcome to Annemarie Russell and her Salt House Story.
This is my favorite daughter, Maya. She's my only daughter. I want to start today with a poem by Oregon poet William Stafford. So Maya's going to read the poem for us.
Ask me. Sometime when the river is ice, ask me mistakes I have made. Ask me whether what I have done is my life. Others have come in their slow way into my thought, and some have tried to help or to hurt. Ask me what difference their strongest love or hate has made. I will listen to what you say. You and I can turn and look at the silent river and wait. We know the current is there, hidden, and there are comings and goings from miles away that hold the stillness exactly before us. What the river says, that is what I say.
Thank you, sweetie. Good morning. Our theme at Salt House this Advent is recognizing and living into life's detours as a way to more fully wait for the birth of Jesus. This season issues us an invitation to let God reset our expectations about the way life is supposed to go so we can live more fully into the life God calls us to. This, I believe, is one of the gifts we receive during the season of Advent if we open ourselves fully to this season of waiting. In my story, and probably in yours too, detours are just the way it goes. I'm honored today to share part of my family's story and the giant detour we are on, one we didn't expect nor ask for. But that's the way detours are. They come when we least expect them, and they change us in ways we never thought possible. But before telling you about the detour we're on now, there's another detour that I think of as the beginning of the story, and I'd like to start there. Maya was 3, and Sam was just 3 months old when our family moved from Oregon to Pullman, Washington, so Aaron could finish his doctoral residency at the University of Idaho, just across the border in Moscow. We settled into a new town and began attending Pullman Presbyterian Church, where our Whitworth friends, Matt and Amy, were the co-pastors. One of the first Sundays, we met another family, the Watsons, Phil, Caitlin, and their infant daughter, Grace, who was born just 10 days before our son, Sam. Caitlin and I, both moms who were new to town, started spending time together. We took walks, shared meals in our stories, and enjoyed a new friendship that was life-giving to both of us during a crazy, lonely season of parenting young children in a new place. Then the unthinkable happened. Early in October, Pastor Amy called to tell me that baby Grace had died that morning at daycare. And since they were out of town, Amy wondered if I could go to the hospital to provide care and support to the grieving friends. I went, of course, trembling as I drove the 7 miles across the border to the hospital in Moscow. When I arrived at the emergency department, I was ushered into a small room with couches where Phil and Caitlin sat, sobbing with grief. These were new friends, and I had no idea what to do, so I dropped to the floor, laying one hand on each of them, and I sobbed along with them, offering the only thing I could, my presence and my silent support amidst their grief. As hours and then days unfolded following Grace's death, I wondered how I was going to companion these friends with my own infant son at my side. The straight, predictable path that had stretched before me, a quick year in Eastern Washington while Aaron completed his residency, turned into a journey of grief and loss as we grew close to our new friends and supported them in an intensely dark season. I learned so many things that year: how to be present with someone in their darkness and grief, when to talk and when to shut up and just listen, how to breathe through my own fear of losing my child, and how to navigate my guilt at having a child still alive while my friend's child had died, and how to take one dark day at a time. Talk about a detour. I knew God was present with us during that season, and I felt deep inside that despite the pain, sadness, and tension, there was a purpose in us being in Pullman that year, that as cliche as it may sound, we were supposed to be there so we could travel that journey of grief and loss with our friends. But it was also a detour. What I didn't know was that during that year, companioning my dear friend Caitlin, I was growing in wisdom that would prepare me for another detour that waited down the road. Until this point, I had pretty much expected my life to follow the typical narrative that Pastor Sarah talked about last week. Get married, have healthy children, buy a house, have a good job, send kids off to college, retire and enjoy retirement with Aaron by my side. Never in my wildest dreams had I imagined this wouldn't be my story. Never had I expected that a person could do everything right and still end up detoured in grief and loss. Our year in Pullman isn't even a real beginning to our own story, because in many ways it doesn't connect at all. But it was when my perfect vision of my life began to crack open. And I remember realizing that nothing about my life was guaranteed nor certain, no matter what I did. Fast forward 2 years. Aaron finished his residency, and we moved back to Western Washington, where Aaron started a new psychology practice, and I began teaching English at Trinity Lutheran College. With 2 healthy biological kids already in our family, Aaron and I had been exploring the call to international adoption. My sister Amy is adopted from Korea, so I grew up in a family who had long ago said yes to adoption. And while it wasn't a perfect road, I was so grateful for both my siblings and the way Amy's adoption completed our family in a way that felt right. I had always hoped for 3 children, and for several years had prayed that we could complete our own family by bringing home a child from another country. I was so grateful when Aaron and I landed on the same page that winter, and we excitedly began the lengthy adoption process together. International adoption isn't an easy path. It takes enormous time, paperwork, and financial resources to make it to the finish line. Once we had decided upon a special needs adoption from China, one of the most poignant parts of the process was making a list of the special needs we were willing to take. It almost felt like looking at a restaurant menu and placing an order. Yes, we could do cleft lip and palate or heart problems. No, it would be too hard to adopt a child with serious mobility issues because our family is so active. But for me, and I think for Aaron too, the biggest no we both said firmly and with no question was the adoption of a child with any kind of pervasive developmental delay. We knew we didn't have the patience, the wisdom, or the experience to handle a special need like that. So, of course, we left it off the list. On November 28, 2011, while out to dinner as a family, we received a call from our adoption case manager telling us we'd been matched with a little boy from China with a cleft lip and palate. It was his first birthday. We went home, lit a candle, and sang happy birthday to our boy halfway around the world. 2 days later, we formally said yes to the referral, and 6 months later, we traveled to China to pick up our Matthew. Walking into the Civil Affairs office in Guangzhou, China, on May 28, 2012, the heat and noise was deafening. Children screamed, parents nervously paced the room, waiting for their new son or daughter to arrive. After waiting for what seemed like an eternity, watching other moms and dads open their arms to welcome their kids, a nanny carrying a small, dark-eyed boy walked into the room. It was our Matthew. Mama, she asked me in garbled English when I bolted to her side. Yes, I am his mama. This is my boy, I replied, and she handed Matthew to me. He was terrified, eyes wide open, clinging to my arms. Aaron rushed to my side, and we introduced ourselves to our boy. Later, we would both admit that from that first moment, we knew Matthew wasn't a typical kid. At 18 months, he didn't speak, he couldn't walk, he couldn't even sit up, and he didn't eat solid food. He didn't know what to do with toys, and he clearly hadn't been touched or played with very frequently. That moment was probably when our road took a serious detour, even though we didn't quite recognize the significance at the time. I think it was probably 2 years later, at the appointment in the neurodevelopmental pediatrician's office, when we officially learned that our sweet baby would live his life plagued by neurological differences, autism, and ADHD. We turned the corner and found a massive detour sign stuck in our way, and there was no way to dodge it this time. What was the path I had expected? Well, most families bring their special needs kids home from China and get fixed. Cleft lips get repaired, holes in hearts get sewn up. We knew that bringing a child home would bring many challenges, identity issues, questions about birth parents, the particular cultural awareness of being a transracial family. Aaron and I had prepared for all these things as well as we could. We had taken classes, gone to trainings, read all the right books. And while I didn't expect that our road would be easy, I imagined that our boy would come home, learn to talk, develop in a typical way, and join his 2 older siblings in being a successful student, a kid full of words and personality who grew up to graduate from high school, head off to college, and live independently. But clearly that wasn't the detour we were on. I desperately wanted to be back on the road I had expected. Matthew's autism diagnosis and ensuing behavioral challenges plunged us into a season of grief and loss. It was a dark time. I remember praying through gritted teeth, why, God, does this have to be our story? We can't do this. We're not equipped. This isn't what we signed up for. But perhaps the biggest question, the hardest thing to stomach, was that we just didn't know where Matthew's diagnosis and challenges would lead us. There was no way to know. We had to wait. Sometimes I think of Mary and Joseph, that story we read this morning from the Gospel of Matthew. Talk about a detour. Hey, Joseph, your girlfriend is pregnant with a child that's not yours. You should marry her anyhow. Give the baby a name and claim him as your son. Adopt him into your family. Just like us, Joseph has the experience of having his expectations of family detoured. The story invites us to let God reset our expectations about who our family is, about how family works, and about how to let go of our own unmet expectations about family. Just like Joseph, Aaron and I ended up on this path we never asked for nor expected, raising a boy whom we love deeply, but who lives daily with behavioral challenges, developmental delays, and sometimes even aggression towards those he loves. You may not have noticed, but sometimes I come to church with scratches on my arms or my face after Matthew's emotional dysregulation turns aggressive and I become the target. Sometimes it's Aaron with these scratches, and sometimes it's even Maya or Sam. Some Sunday mornings, Matthew falls asleep in the car, sometimes after being up since 4 a.m., usually companioned by one of us in those early mornings. And we spend the whole service going in and out to check and see if he's still sleeping. And sometimes on a really bad Sunday, we leave early because Matthew can't tolerate a whole hour at Salt House. We've given up a lot on this detoured road. We can't go out to dinner as a family. Traveling is hard. A family vacation to Disneyland is pretty much impossible. We feel a great deal of anxiety when we have a house guest or even family friends over for dinner because Matthew might get aggressive or have a meltdown and derail the whole evening. We don't go to public places much because Matthew is in a very hard stage where he's aggressive toward little kids. And even if he's feeling gentle, he still makes funny noises, like he is right now, engages in repetitive self-stimulatory behaviors, and sometimes even shouts or yells out of context. When we are out and about, we get a lot of funny looks and sometimes even hurtful comments. I've had to bite my lip on more than one occasion as I'm escorting my out-of-control child out to the car while deflecting dirty or judgmental looks from people around me. And one terrible afternoon last summer, while visiting my brother and his family in New Jersey, I was trying to protect myself in a parking lot while Matthew raged angrily toward my body when a strange man walked up to me and threatened to call the police because he mistakenly thought I was abusing my child. I started to cry, and I explained our family's situation. And in that moment, I knew my only weapon was the truth. But perhaps the biggest challenge of this detour is that we always have to think 10 steps ahead about every single thing, which makes it so very exhausting so much of the time. Can we stop to get coffee, or will Starbucks be too stimulating for Matthew? Is Matthew tired or hungry or about to have a meltdown? Do we need to cut our errand short and go straight home? We've had windows broken, special keepsakes destroyed, light switches ripped off the walls, and blankets and pillows torn to bits. Almost everything we own or care about is at risk of being ruined when a meltdown or tantrum happens. This past August, our detour derailed us again as we found ourselves in the psychiatric and behavioral unit of Seattle Children's Hospital, where Matthew spent a week in the inpatient setting as the psychiatrist worked to stabilize him and re-regulate his medication, and we got some behavioral services set up at home. Having an autistic child in the psych ward for aggression is a pretty terrible thing to live through. Things have improved a little since then, but we still have a long path ahead of us. Our life isn't normal, and it probably never will be. We have a child who will always need constant supervision and support, who will likely never live independently, who might never have a real friend, pass a standardized test, play on a sports team, eat a meal on his own, or even say just one sentence aloud in his own voice. His story and development are certainly unfolding slowly without any kind of roadmap. We're waiting to see how it all turns out in the end. This is our Advent season. When I'm in the best, most compassionate space about our own detour, I also recognize with deep love and sorrow that Matthew's own life is a detour. Left on a street corner at 3 days old, his infant months spent in an impoverished orphanage, a brain and neurochemistry that must frustrate the heck out of him. That is his giant detour too. And while I'm not here to tell his story, I also recognize the deep loss, grief, and anger that he must feel in his own body sometimes, without words to describe it. He is a human being living his own detoured life, and we are doing everything we can to provide a stable path for him. I also want to tell you how grateful our family is for the community here at Salt House and the welcome we feel for our family and for Matthew. This hasn't been our experience in other churches. We felt free to bring Matthew with us to worship here and know that people here welcome and love him for the person he is, even when he's making strange, loud noises or whooping in the back row while playing monster trucks on his Kindle. Here we don't feel like we have to make excuses for his strange behaviors or try to silence him during worship. Since he's not a very social guy, he's not one to make his own connections with people, but his sense of peace and comfort in this room is palpable. And this church has become a familiar place for him. Thank you for being his community and for loving him just the way he is. And if I'm being totally transparent, I must also admit that sometimes parts of the Christian story are hard for me to stomach. Our own story and the detours that are part of that reality are hard and messy and challenging. Something that doesn't always fit with the dominant Christian narrative of perfection and straight paths and blessings. Some people tell us, wow, I could never do what you're doing. May God bless you. Or God knew what he was doing when he put Matthew in your family. Those kinds of statements honestly only make me feel more alone and detoured. But Advent helps bring me back around to the Jesus story that I believe to be true, reminding me that detours are part of God's ever-unfolding story. And it's more than just God's story, truly. It's a story we are creating together as a community of people. More than a few of you already have stood beside us in times of challenge and grief. You've given us courage. You've brought us a meal. You've sent a card or a text to encourage us. This season of Advent is meant to be walked together, waiting to see just how things are going to turn out. We never know what's around the next bend, a straight path or a rocky one. We can't predict when the next crisis or loss will occur. But friends, this Advent we can hold hands and walk together, waiting once again for that baby to be born. We can think about Joseph and Mary, so young and poor, and probably afraid, traveling that long way to Bethlehem, only to welcome their baby into the world in an animal shed. That can't have been part of their plan for their own family story, but it's the detour that their lives took anyhow. And so goes our story with our sweet brown-eyed boy who turned 8 just a couple weeks ago. One of the gifts of a detour is that we're forced to walk more slowly, with eyes wide open, in order to adjust to the unfamiliar landscape we found ourselves in. We take less for granted. We learn to wait more patiently. We give up holding the reins, since it's clear we haven't been driving the wagon for quite some time now. We have learned to live with a great deal of uncertainty. And if I'm being honest, I will tell you that I have also learned a little bit more about God. About a year ago, on the tail end of the season of intense darkness and grief following Matthew's diagnosis, I was taking a walk one day, praying aloud. I said once again, as I did often, God, I can't do this. This isn't what I signed up for. Immediately after I spoke those audible words, I felt this amazing sense of peace and wisdom flood my body. And I thought in my head, but this is what God signed us up for. Rather than feeling duped or gypped as I had been feeling for so long, I had this realization that God has always been calling us to this path, even when we didn't know it. This is our story. There isn't a different one. The typical healthy baby whom we imagined would come home with us from China, he doesn't exist. There has only and always been our sweet Matthew, our smart, creative, crazy, unpredictable, sometimes loud and aggressive boy, who brings us both joy and sorrow, who makes our lives wretchedly hard and beautifully whole, all at the same time. And I guess if I'm being really honest, the truth is that what looked like a detour is really the path we were always meant to walk. It isn't scenic or straight. In fact, it might be the most challenging road I've ever walked. But it's our way, and we're walking it together. Before I started speaking this morning, Maya read a poem by Oregon poet William Stafford that has companioned me in my life's journey over the last 15 years. That's what you get when you have an English teacher and professor, right? In your soul. Poems become your friends. The speaker of this poem says, "Ask me if what I have done is my life." I think both Aaron and I ask this question all the time right now. Sometimes we look at each other in disbelief and say, this can't be real, can it? This poem also compares life to a river and says, we know the current is there, hidden. It gives me great comfort to know that our family's story continues to flow like a river, and the current is underneath, hidden, even when we can't see it. We are still walking a road, even if we're not sure where we're going. We're still listening to God's call, trusting that our waiting, our advent, will lead us somewhere that we are meant to go. Sometimes I wonder if Joseph and Mary felt the same way. This baby, this Jesus, wasn't part of their life's plan, but he was certainly part of God's plan. So Joseph took Mary as his wife. They traveled far away to Bethlehem, where their son was born. They named the baby Jesus, as the angel had told them. And they embraced a massive detour that would never again lead them down an easy path that they were probably hoping for. Instead, their detour would lead them to a hill on a dark Friday night, where their baby would one day die in a life-altering act of love. Amen.